He thought he could humiliate Barron Trump through his narrative until Barron Trump turned the tables with his own words on live national TV. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and the energy in the studio was sharp enough to cut through steel. A packed audience, millions watching from their screens, and two figures seated across from each other, both waiting for the other to make the first move. Barron Trump sat poised, his expression unreadable, while the well-known liberal reporter David Langford adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He leaned in slightly, his voice carrying the kind of forced confidence that hinted at an agenda. "Barron, let's be honest, the American people deserve the truth. Your father, Donald Trump, misled this country at every turn. Just last week, he claimed that under his presidency, the economy was stronger than it had ever been. But let's face it, under Biden, unemployment is down, and wages are up. Isn't it time we stop pretending that Trump's policies were anything but disastrous?" A flicker of amusement crossed Barron's face. It was the kind of expression that said, "I was waiting for this." He took a breath, letting the silence stretch for just a fraction too long, enough to make the tension thicken. Then he spoke, his tone measured but firm. "David, I appreciate the attempt, but let's not rewrite history. You're standing here on national television telling the American people that things are better under Biden. Let's talk facts instead of feelings." He turned slightly toward the camera, knowing full well how this moment would play out across social media. Under Trump, gas prices were at an average of $2.70 per gallon. Under Biden, Americans are struggling to pay over $4 in many states. Inflation under Trump was less than 2%. Under Biden, it skyrocketed to over 9% at its peak. David quickly cut in, his voice a little sharper now. "Now, that's misleading, Barron. Inflation is a global issue, and let's not pretend Trump had no hand in setting up the economic downturn we saw when Biden took office." Barron didn't flinch. He simply reached for his notes and lifted a single sheet of paper. "This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, December 2020, right before Biden took office. Inflation rate, 1.4%. That's not a setup for disaster, that's a stable economy. Now, let's look at January 2022, under Biden's leadership, 7.5%. And you want to tell the American people that Trump's policies were the problem?" David exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. The signs were subtle, but Barron caught them. David was recalibrating, trying to find another angle. But before he could speak, Barron continued. "And let's address unemployment since you brought it up. The Biden administration loves to pat itself on the back for the low unemployment rate, but they conveniently leave out the context. Under Trump, before the pandemic, we hit the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, 3.5%. That was a record. When COVID hit, of course, unemployment spiked. That was a global crisis, not a policy failure. Yet, even then, Trump led the fastest economic recovery in modern history. Biden inherited an economy that was already bouncing back. He didn't fix anything. He just took credit for the rebound that was already happening." David let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Barron, you're twisting the narrative. And let's not forget," Barron leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on David. "My father may be facing legal battles, but are we supposed to ignore the real issues under Biden? There's corruption in both parties, David. Let's stop pretending that only one side has dirty hands." David blinked, trying to shift the conversation, but Barron wasn't done. "Let's address the real problems, David. We've seen a rise in energy prices under Biden's administration, policies that have been less transparent, and a struggle to maintain America's strength abroad. Meanwhile, under my father's leadership, we had energy independence and were respected on the global stage. Should we really ignore that?" David's face was getting redder, his frustration growing. He was starting to realize that Barron was no longer the quiet figure everyone expected him to be. "You can't ignore all of that, David," Barron continued, his tone unwavering. What we're seeing here isn't just a matter of political preference. It's about what's actually working. Under my father, this country had more jobs, lower taxes, and a stronger economy. David quickly interrupted, his voice rising. Trump is facing multiple legal battles, Barron. He incited chaos, refused to accept the election results, and is now facing indictment after indictment. The American people should trust him after all that? Barron tilted his head, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. David, I have a question for you. You keep calling Trump untrustworthy, but how do you explain this? He reached under the table and pulled out a small remote. With a single click, a video clip began playing on the studio screen behind them. David's face drained of color as he saw the video. The audio was crisp, unmistakable, it was his own voice. Taken from an interview just months ago, the clip played as David's words echoed across the studio. If we're being objective, Trump's economic policies did lead to historic job growth and increased wages. You may not like his style, but you can't argue with the numbers. The irony hit Barron like a freight train. The very reporter who had just painted Trump's presidency as an economic disaster was now confronted with his own words. Undeniable proof that he had once admitted the opposite. Barron let the silence stretch, giving the moment the weight it deserved. He didn't need to say anything just yet. The audience, both in the studio and at home, was already filling in the blanks. David's mouth opened slightly, but he forced out a chuckle. Barron, you're taking that out of context. That was during a different time. Barron leaned forward. Different time, David? You made that statement just 8 months ago. If facts change that quickly for you, maybe the audience should start questioning what else you conveniently forget when it suits your narrative. David's hands curled slightly on the desk. He was a veteran in the media game, used to controlling the narrative, but this was different. The power had shifted, and Barron knew it. The real problem, Barron continued, his tone unwavering, isn't that you got it wrong before. It's that you get on television today and pretend like you never said it. That's the problem with so much of mainstream media. You rewrite history in real time and expect people not to notice. But they do, David. They notice. David shook his head, forcing a tight smile. Look, if we're going to talk about honesty, let's talk about Trump's behavior. He incited chaos, refused to accept election results, and is facing multiple indictments. Are we supposed to just ignore all of that? Barron exhaled, tilting his head slightly. Let's be clear on something. Trump questioned the results of the 2020 election. So did Hillary Clinton in 2016. So did Stacey Abrams in Georgia. The difference? When Democrats question election results, it's protecting democracy. When Republicans do it, it's a threat to democracy. The studio audience murmured. David shifted again. And as for the indictments, Barron continued, we've seen this movie before. Political lawfare is nothing new. But let's pretend for a second that Trump is as guilty as you want people to believe. Are you ready to hold Biden to the same standard? Because I've got a list of alleged corruption scandals involving his family that you conveniently never bring up. David scoffed. Conspiracy theories. Barron raised a brow. Oh, so now we're doing the anything that makes my side look bad is a conspiracy theory routine? That's cute. But let's be real, David. This isn't about truth, it's about control. The media decides what's worth covering and what's worth burying. You're not informing people. You're managing them. David opened his mouth to respond, but he was out of time. Because Barron wasn't done yet. David Langford was drowning, and everyone could see it. The confidence he walked in with had been chipped away, piece by piece, until only frustration remained. He knew the cameras were on him, knew every expression, every nervous glance, every misplaced breath would be dissected online within minutes. But Barron wasn't backing off. He leaned in slightly, his voice calm but unshakable. "Let's try something simple, David. Yes or no, did you or did you not say that Trump's economic policies led to historic job growth?" David let out a sharp breath. "Look, I already explained." "Yes or no," Barron pressed. His eyes locked onto David's. David hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. "Yes, but..." Barron nodded. "Now, if that was true 8 months ago, what exactly changed? Did the facts suddenly rewrite themselves, or did you just decide they were no longer convenient?" David's face hardened. He knew he was being backed into a corner, and he hated it. "You're oversimplifying things, Barron. Context matters." Barron tilted his head slightly, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Oh, I agree. Context does matter. So let's add some more, shall we?" He reached down, pulled out a folder, and slid a printed transcript across the table. "This is a list of every time you've shifted your stance depending on who was in office. In 2019, you wrote that rising wages and record-low unemployment prove the economy is thriving. That was under Trump. In 2022, under Biden, you said unemployment numbers don't tell the full story. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. You flipped your position, David. Not because the economy changed, but because the person in charge changed." David's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers curled slightly as he glanced at the transcript, then back up at Barron. He knew he couldn't refute something he had written himself. "You don't report the news," Barron continued, his tone sharp but steady. "You shape it. You tell people what to think, and when facts don't fit the narrative you're selling, you twist them. That's not journalism. That's propaganda." The studio was dead silent. Even the audience, which had been murmuring throughout the debate, seemed to hold its collective breath. David's jaw clenched. He tried to gather himself, but the damage was done. He had been exposed. Not just as someone who had misspoken, but as someone who had deliberately manipulated information to fit a narrative. And then came the final blow. Barron sat back in his chair, exhaling as if this whole exchange had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "You know what's really interesting, David? After all this, you still won't admit you were wrong. Not once. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? It's not about truth. It's about control. It's about making sure people believe what you want them to believe, no matter how many times you have to rewrite the story to make that happen." David Langford had nothing left. No retort, no defense. No pivot that could save him. And the world was watching. The second the cameras cut, David Langford yanked off his earpiece, avoiding eye contact with Barron as he muttered something under his breath. The studio crew exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they had just witnessed a career-altering moment. Barron, on the other hand, remained composed. He stood, smoothed out his blazer, and shook hands with the moderator, gracious in victory. But outside the studio, chaos was unfolding. By the time Barron stepped outside, his phone was buzzing non-stop. Notifications flooded in, news articles, viral tweets, reaction videos, and hashtags. Hashtag Barron Trump exposes media was the #1 trending topic. One clip had already amassed over 1 million views, with captions like, "Watch David Langford's soul leave his body in real time." Even networks that typically ignored Barron couldn't stay silent. Some tried to downplay it, calling the exchange heated. Others took David's side, accusing Barron of bad faith tactics. But the damage was done, the footage was everywhere. More telling, however, was who didn't say anything. David Langford's own network was silent. No segment replaying the interview. No panel discussion defending him. And the most brutal indicator? David didn't tweet. For a man who built his career on crafting narratives, that silence spoke louder than words. By the end of the week, whispers began circulating in media circles. Is Langford done? Producers were reconsidering his contract renewal. He might take a temporary leave to let things cool off. No official statement came, no attempts to recover from the humiliation, because really, how do you recover from something like that? Meanwhile, Barron Trump wasn't just trending, he was booked. More networks reached out for interviews, podcast invites poured in. Even those who didn't always agree with him couldn't ignore what he had done. And the lesson from it all? People were tired. Tired of media manipulation. Tired of the double standards. Tired of being told what to think, only for the narrative to change when it was convenient. Barron hadn't just won a debate, he had exposed a system. As Barron sat in his car, watching the headlines flood in, he smiled, not because of some personal victory, but because of what it represented. People weren't just listening, they were questioning. And in a world where narratives are controlled, asking the right questions is the most powerful thing you can do. If you believe in truth over spin, in facts over feelings, don't just sit back and watch. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay engaged. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because this is just the beginning.